June 22, 1941, Adolf Hitler launched the largest invasion in military history when more than 3 million German and Axis soldiers crossed into the Soviet Union across a front that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, beginning a campaign that Nazi Germany believed would destroy Stalin's state in a matter of months and deliver the land, food, oil, and raw materials Hitler needed to turn his empire into something permanent. At first, everything seemed to prove him right. Soviet aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Border armies were shattered. Entire fronts collapsed. German panzer groups drove so deep into Soviet territory that the world seemed to be watching another version of France in 1940, only on a scale so much larger that the destruction almost defied understanding. But what really happened when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union was not the quick collapse he had promised himself, because every German victory pulled the Wehrmacht deeper into a country it had underestimated. Against an enemy that kept surviving disasters no ordinary army should have survived, until the invasion that was supposed to win the war became the campaign that made Germany's defeat possible. By the summer of 1941, Nazi Germany stood at the height of its power, but not in the secure position Hitler wanted the world to see. France had fallen. The Low Countries had been conquered. Norway, Denmark, Poland, Yugoslavia, and Greece had been overrun. German armies seemed almost unbeatable on land, yet Britain had not surrendered. The Royal Navy still controlled the seas, and Germany's war economy remained vulnerable because it lacked the long-term resources needed for a conflict against the British Empire and increasingly a United States that was supplying Britain even before entering the war. Hitler could occupy much of Europe, but he could not make the blockade disappear, and he could not tolerate the fact that Germany was still receiving important food, oil, and raw materials from the very Soviet Union he intended to destroy. The Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939 had always been temporary in Hitler's mind. It had allowed Germany and the Soviet Union to divide Poland and avoid war with each other while Hitler turned west. But Nazi ideology had been built for years around hatred of Bolshevism, conquest in the East, and the belief that the peoples of the Soviet Union could be conquered, displaced, enslaved, or starved for German benefit. Hitler did not see the Soviet Union only as a military enemy. He saw it as the center of the racial and ideological war he had always wanted. And when he looked east in 1941, he believed the land beyond Poland could solve Germany's strategic problems if it could be seized quickly enough. That word, quickly, mattered more than almost anything else. Germany could not afford a long war against the Soviet Union while Britain remained in the fight. The entire logic of Operation Barbarossa depended on speed. The Red Army had to be destroyed near the frontier. The Soviet state had to be shocked into collapse. The Wehrmacht had to reach deep into Soviet territory before the campaign turned into a struggle of distance, fuel, railways, replacements, and production. Hitler and many of his commanders believed this was possible because the Soviet Union looked weaker than it truly was. Stalin's purges had killed, imprisoned, or removed thousands of officers. The Red Army had performed poorly in Finland. Soviet command structures were still being reorganized. German intelligence underestimated Soviet reserves and the ability of the state to raise new armies. From Berlin, the Soviet Union looked huge but brittle. Hitler believed the door only had to be kicked in. In the early hours of June 22nd, German forces began doing exactly that. The invasion struck with overwhelming force. As Army Group North drove through the Baltic region toward Leningrad, Army Group Center advanced toward Minsk, Smolensk, and ultimately Moscow, and Army Group South pushed into Ukraine, where Hitler's hunger for food, coal, industry, and eventually the oil of the Caucasus made the southern campaign especially important. This was not only a map exercise for German planners. The East was supposed to feed the Reich, supply its armies, break Britain's last hope for a continental ally, and create the empire Hitler had imagined long before the war began. Soviet soldiers along the frontier were thrown into chaos. Stalin had received warnings, but he remained suspicious of British attempts to provoke a German-Soviet war and unwilling to give Hitler a pretext. Soviet trains carrying raw materials had continued moving toward Germany almost until the last hours before the attack, while German units were already preparing to cross the border. When the invasion began, many Soviet commanders did not know whether to counterattack, retreat, or wait for orders that were already too late to matter. The Luftwaffe struck Soviet airfields almost immediately, destroying enormous numbers of aircraft before they could take off, and the German army followed with the kind of mobile warfare that had already transformed Europe. Panzer formations broke through weak points, raced into the rear, cut communications, surrounded armies, and waited for slower infantry to close the pockets and destroy what had been trapped. It was not magic, and it was not as clean as later maps made it appear, but to Soviet soldiers caught in the first weeks of the invasion, it felt like the front was being torn open faster than orders could reach them. Units were cut off before they understood where the enemy was. Headquarters lost contact with armies. Roads filled with refugees, retreating troops, wrecked vehicles, dead horses, and columns of prisoners moving west under German guard. The early victories were enormous. Around Minsk, German forces encircled large parts of the Soviet Western Front, destroying or capturing hundreds of thousands of men and opening the road farther east. In the south, Soviet resistance was harder and the terrain was more difficult, but German forces still pushed forward. In the north, the road toward Leningrad began to open. To the German command, the evidence seemed overwhelming. The Red Army was collapsing. The Soviet state was losing territory, and men at a rate no European power had ever survived. The war looked like it was following the same pattern as Poland and France, only with larger numbers and longer roads. But the first sign of disaster was hidden inside the success. The Germans were destroying Soviet armies, yet the Soviet Union did not stop producing armies. Units that German planners did not expect began appearing. Reserves moved forward. New formations were raised. Soviet industry began preparing to move east, away from the advancing Germans and toward the Urals and Siberia, where factories could continue producing beyond the reach of the invasion. Stalin's system was brutal, inefficient, and often wasteful with human life, but it had a capacity for mobilization. Germany had failed to understand. The Wehrmacht could surround one Soviet army and find another forming behind it. It could destroy tanks and face newer ones. It could measure victory by territory taken and prisoners captured, while the campaign itself was quietly becoming something Germany had not planned to fight. At Smolensk, the warning became harder to ignore. German panzer groups pushed forward and again threatened to trap major Soviet forces. But Soviet resistance stiffened. Reinforcements arrived, and counterattacks struck at German units that had raced ahead of their infantry and supply lines. The Germans still won the battle, and they still inflicted terrible losses, but the victory did not feel like the end of resistance. It cost time. It cost fuel. It wore down the panzer divisions that were supposed to keep driving toward Moscow. By the middle of the summer, the Germans had advanced hundreds of miles and captured vast numbers of prisoners, but the Soviet Union had not broken. And the most dangerous thing for Germany was that its own army was beginning to feel the distance between battlefield victories and strategic victory. The farther the Germans advanced, the more the country itself became part of the war against them. Soviet roads were few, often poor, and easily ruined by weather and traffic. German trucks broke down under the strain. Horses still pulled much of the army's transport, and they died in large numbers from exhaustion, hunger, and the conditions of the campaign. Railways existed, but Soviet tracks used a wider gauge than German trains. forcing the Germans to convert lines before they could use them properly. Bridges were destroyed, depots were moved or burned. Crops, fuel, and equipment were denied to the invader whenever Soviet authorities could do it. The German army had been built to win quickly, but now it was trying to feed, fuel, and repair itself across enormous distances in a country whose infrastructure could not support the speed of its advance. This was where the campaign began to turn into a contradiction. The Germans had to keep moving fast because their entire plan depended on a quick decision. But the faster they moved, the more their supply lines stretched, and the weaker their forward units became. Panzer divisions that looked powerful on maps were losing tanks to combat, breakdowns, and distance. Infantry divisions marched endlessly behind the armored spearheads, arriving too late to exploit some victories and too tired to make the next advance easier. The Luftwaffe still struck hard, but airfields had to be moved forward, fuel had to be delivered, and aircraft had to operate over a front that seemed to widen every week. Germany had created a war in which every mile of success made the next mile harder. The campaign was also a war of annihilation from the beginning. German military operations were tied to Nazi plans for occupation, exploitation, starvation, and murder. Behind the front came the Einsatzgruppen and other killing units, supported at times by police, soldiers, and local collaborators who murdered Jews, communists, Roma, disabled people, and others marked as enemies of Nazi rule. Towns and villages that fell under German control did not simply become occupied territory. They became part of a genocidal project in which entire communities were rounded up, taken to ravines, forests, pits, and fields, and shot. This brutality did not make the German occupation stronger in the long run. It helped turn the war into a struggle where surrender often meant death, imprisonment, starvation, or the destruction of whole communities. Soviet soldiers who might have collapsed as a normal army facing normal defeat were instead fighting an invader whose intentions were visible in burned villages, mass graves, and the treatment of prisoners. Operation Barbarossa was therefore not only a military gamble, it was the opening of the most brutal front of the Second World War, where the destruction of armies and the destruction of civilian populations moved together from the first months of the invasion. By late summer, Hitler and his commanders faced the problem their plan had tried to avoid. They had not defeated the Soviet Union quickly, and now they had to decide where the main effort should go next. Moscow was the political and communications heart of the Soviet state, and many German generals believed Army Group Center should keep driving toward it. Hitler, however, was deeply focused on Ukraine, its grain, coal, industry, and the need to destroy Soviet forces on the flanks before moving farther east. German armor was diverted south, contributing to the massive encirclement around Kiev, where the Red Army suffered one of the greatest defeats in military history, and hundreds of thousands more Soviet soldiers were killed, captured, or lost from the front. It was another huge German victory. It was also another delay. The debate over Moscow and Ukraine showed how far the campaign had drifted from its original confidence. If the Soviet Union was truly close to collapse, then one more thrust toward Moscow should have ended it. If Ukraine's resources and Soviet armies in the south had to be dealt with first, then Barbarossa was already becoming something larger, slower, and more complicated than the quick campaign Germany had promised itself. The Wehrmacht could still win enormous battles, but it could no longer win them without spending time it did not have. By the time the final drive toward Moscow began at the end of September, the German army had won some of the largest battles ever fought, but it was no longer the force that had crossed the frontier in June. Its tanks and trucks were worn down. Its infantry had marched across hundreds of miles. Its supply system was struggling. Its commanders were still being asked to deliver the quick decision that had already slipped away. Operation Typhoon, the offensive toward Moscow, began with the same terrible pattern as the earlier battles. German forces broke through, surrounded Soviet armies at Vyazma and Bryansk, and captured hundreds of thousands more prisoners. Panic reached Moscow. Government offices were evacuated. Civilians dug defenses. The danger to the Soviet capital became real. Yet even then, the Soviet Union did not collapse. The Red Army kept fighting through losses that would have destroyed most states. New units came forward. Commanders learned, often at horrific cost, how to slow the German advance. The Soviet leadership prepared the defense of Moscow with a desperation sharpened by the knowledge that losing the capital could carry political and psychological consequences beyond the battlefield. Stalin remained in the city, and fresh forces were brought in as German units pushed closer. The Germans could see the prize, but seeing it was not the same as having the strength to take it. Then the weather changed. Autumn rains turned the roads into mud. Vehicles sank into tracks that became rivers of clay. Horses struggled. Supply columns slowed. Artillery, fuel, ammunition, food, and winter clothing fell behind the needs of the front. When the ground froze again, the Germans resumed the advance, but freezing weather brought its own suffering. Many German soldiers did not have proper winter equipment because the campaign was not supposed to last this long. Weapons malfunctioned, engines failed, frostbite spread. Units that had already been reduced by months of combat now had to attack through cold, exhaustion, and shortages against a defender whose resistance was increasing instead of fading. By early December, German spearheads had reached the outer approaches to Moscow, and in some places they were close enough that the capital seemed almost within reach. But the army that stood before Moscow was dangerously spent. Its supply lines were overstretched, its mobile units were weakened, and its men were fighting at the edge of what they could endure. Hitler had demanded one last push, but the Soviet defense had survived long enough for the moment Germany feared most. On December 5th, Soviet forces launched a major counteroffensive around Moscow, striking German units that had reached the limit of their strength. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht was thrown back from a major objective on land. The Soviet counteroffensive did not destroy the German army, but it destroyed the idea behind Barbarossa. Moscow had not fallen. Stalin's state had not collapsed. The Red Army had not vanished after the first encirclements. The Soviet people had suffered losses almost beyond imagination, but the country remained in the war, and that meant Germany was now trapped in the very kind of conflict Hitler could not afford. Britain still fought. The United States would soon be fully in the war after Pearl Harbor. The Soviet Union remained alive, mobilizing manpower and industry on a scale Germany could not match over time. Barbarossa had been designed to prevent a long war. Instead, it created one. The failure of the invasion was not caused by one thing alone. Winter did not save the Soviet Union by itself. Mud did not defeat Germany by itself. Hitler's decisions mattered. German overconfidence mattered. Soviet resilience mattered. Logistics mattered. Ideology mattered. And the sheer size of the Soviet state mattered. The deeper truth was that Germany had begun a campaign that required everything to go right quickly against an enemy that could survive almost everything going wrong. The Wehrmacht could win border battles, take cities, encircle armies, and capture millions, but it could not force the Soviet Union to stop fighting in the time Germany had allowed for victory. By the spring of 1942, the Eastern Front had become something different from what German planners had imagined in June 1941. It was no longer a campaign to crush the Soviet Union in one season. It was a war of attrition across an enormous front, fought by societies willing and able to consume men, machines, cities, villages, and entire populations in order to survive or conquer. For Nazi Germany, that was the strategic disaster hidden beneath the spectacular victories of Barbarossa. Hitler invaded the Soviet Union to secure the resources and space he believed would make his empire unstoppable. But the invasion instead dragged Germany into a war that demanded more men, more fuel, more equipment, more transport, and more time than Germany could provide. What really happened when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union was that Nazi Germany won so much in the first months that it took time to see the campaign was failing. The maps looked impressive. The prisoner columns were enormous. The territory seized was vast, but the Soviet state remained standing behind the wreckage, and the German army was bleeding strength with every mile it advanced. By the time the Germans stood outside Moscow, the promise of a quick victory had already been broken, and once that promise was gone, the invasion that was meant to win the war became the beginning of Germany's ruin. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe for more history content covering wars, revolutions, and events that shaped the modern world.